My ex-wife dropped our daughter at my door with one suitcase and said, "She chose you, so she's your problem now." 6 months later, she appeared at her school demanding her back. My daughter reached into her backpack and handed her something she'd been keeping since the night she left. My ex-wife dropped our daughter at my door 6 months ago with one suitcase and told me, "She chose you, so she's your problem now." I hadn't heard from her since. Then, on a Thursday afternoon in October, she walked into my daughter's elementary school 10 minutes before the dismissal bell, told the front office she was there to take Kira home, and my 9-year-old reached into her backpack, pulled out a folded piece of paper she'd been carrying since the night she was dropped off, and handed it to her mother without saying a word. It was 2:50 p.m. I know that because I was standing 40 feet away in the pickup line in my work boots, still smelling like conduit and pipe dope from a job I'd left half-finished to get there, when Principal Grace Holloway called my cell instead of just letting the front office handle it because, as she told me later, standing in the hallway with her hand still on the phone, something about how calm Renee looked had made her nervous enough to call a parent before calling security. Renee wasn't crying. She wasn't shouting. She was standing in that front office in a blazer I didn't recognize, hair done, voice pleasant and reasonable, telling a 19-year-old front desk aide named Priya Delgado Reyes that there'd been a misunderstanding 6 months ago, and she was here to correct it. That's the detail that still gets me. Not that she came back. That she came back looking like a woman with nothing to apologize for. I'd been an electrician for 11 years by then, ran my own small outfit out of a 2-bay garage. Malone Electric, just me and 2 guys I trusted, mostly residential rewiring and panel upgrades. The kind of work where you learn pretty fast that most problems trace back to something small and hidden that's been sparking quietly behind a wall for a long time before anyone notices the smoke. I'd married Renee Castillo when I was 26. Kira came 2 years later. The marriage didn't survive her, not because of anything Kira did, but because Renee had never wanted the version of stability that a kid actually requires, and by the time Kira was 5, Renee and I were divorced with her holding primary custody, because that's just what the county assumed a mother wanted, and nobody thought hard enough to ask if she was ready for it. She wasn't. I got Kira every other weekend for 4 years, learned to make the most of 36 hours at a time, learned not to ask too many questions about what school nights looked like at Renee's place, because the answers, on the rare occasions I got them, never sat right with me. Renee missed 2 parent-teacher conferences in a row the spring before she left. She let Kira's dentist appointment lapse for over a year. None of it was dramatic enough on its own to take to a lawyer. It was just a slow accumulation of small absences, the kind that don't look like anything until you line them all up afterward and see the shape they were always making. I adjusted my whole business around being ready for the day it finally broke, without ever being asked, the way you rewire a whole panel because one circuit finally blew. 6 months before that afternoon at the school, on a Tuesday night at 7:14 p.m., Renee showed up at my door with Kira and one suitcase, not even a full one, half-zipped, 3 outfits, and a stuffed rabbit stuffed in on top, and said the marriage was over between her and me long before, but apparently being a mother was over too, at least for now, at least for her. "She chose you," she said, standing on my porch step with Kira's small hand, not quite letting go of her coat sleeve, "so she's your problem now." She didn't say goodbye to Kira. She said it to me, over Kira's head, like Kira wasn't standing right there hearing every word of it. Then she got back in her car and drove off, and I stood in my doorway holding a suitcase that weighed less than my toolbox, with a 9-year-old staring up at me like she was waiting to find out if I was going to send her back too. I didn't send her back. I moved her into the guest room that same week, painted it the pale green she picked out of a fan deck at the hardware store, and figured out, one exhausted week at a time, how to run a small business and braid hair and remember picture day, and not fall apart in front of a kid who was already quietly, carefully watching me for signs that this arrangement might also be temporary. The first month was mostly logistics disguised as grief. I learned the school's carpool line by trial and error, burned 2 dinners in a row before I found 4 recipes she'd actually eat, sat in the school parking lot on her 3rd day making a spreadsheet of every form I still needed to fill out with my name instead of Renee's. Kira didn't cry in front of me, not once, not that whole first month, which worried me more than tears would have. She was polite in the specific, careful way kids get when they've learned that being easy is the safest thing to be. My older sister Paige, who lives 20 minutes away and had never had much patience for Renee even before the divorce, showed up most evenings that first month with groceries and no explanation, just started stocking my fridge like it was her job. "She's testing you," Paige told me once, watching Kira from the kitchen doorway as she carefully repacked and rezipped that same suitcase under her bed every few weeks, like she was keeping it ready. Not on purpose. She just doesn't believe yet that this one's going to stick. I noticed that habit. The suitcase. Always packed, always zipped, always under the bed, and told myself it was a grief thing, a control thing, something a good therapist could work through with her eventually. We did get her into counseling, a Tuesday afternoon slot with a child psychologist named Dr. Marielle Fenn that Paige had found through a coworker, and Kira went every week without complaint, and the suitcase habit did, slowly, taper off by month 4. I didn't know yet that it wasn't the suitcase I should have been paying attention to. It was her backpack, which she'd started keeping close enough to touch even at home, even at the dinner table, even asleep. Her 3rd grade teacher, a soft-spoken woman named Ms. Adaora Ibe, mentioned it to me at a parent-teacher conference in month 2, almost in passing, flagging. The way teachers flag things they're not sure are worth flagging. She doesn't like putting her backpack in her cubby with the others, Ms. IB told me, sliding a worksheet across the table like the comment was an afterthought to the actual meeting. Keeps it under her desk instead. I didn't want to make it a thing, but I wanted you to know, in case it's something at home. I told her I'd keep an eye on it. I did keep an eye on it, in the sense that I noticed it every single day for 6 months and filed it every single time. Under grief, understandable, will fade. It never once occurred to me that a 9-year-old might be guarding something specific instead of just clinging to something familiar. I've thought a lot since then about how many good, careful adults, a teacher, a sister, eventually me, all noticed the same behavior and all reached for the same gentle, wrong explanation because the right one was so much stranger than any of us were prepared to consider. The first crack came in that school office, and it wasn't loud because none of what Renee does is ever loud until it needs to be. I got there 4 minutes after Principal Holloway's call, badge scanned in, walked into the front office to find Renee standing at the counter with a folder of her own tucked under one arm, and Kira sitting very still in the chair by the window with her backpack in her lap instead of on the floor where she usually dropped it. 2 other parents were in the office picking up early release kids, and I could feel them both go quiet and pretend to read the bulletin board the moment my voice cracked the room's temperature. Priya Delgado Reyes stood frozen behind the counter with a hall pass half signed, clearly unsure whether this was a situation the front office was actually equipped to handle. Renee turned when she saw me and smiled, an actual smile warm at the edges, the kind she used to give strangers at parties, and said, "Nolan, hi, I was just explaining to the front desk that I'm here to pick up Kira." I told myself, standing there with my heart doing something ugly in my chest, that maybe this was really it. Maybe 6 months of silence had actually been 6 months of getting her life together, and this was a mother trying to come back the wrong way but for the right reason. I've spent 11 years training myself to look for the small hidden problem before I assume the whole system's on fire. I gave her 30 seconds of the benefit of the doubt. It cost me nothing, and it told me everything, because in those 30 seconds she never once asked how Kira was doing, never once looked at her directly, never once crossed the 6 feet of linoleum between them. She asked whether the front office had a form she could sign. I told her as calmly as I could manage in front of my daughter that we weren't doing this here, that if she wanted to talk about custody she could talk to a lawyer like a normal person, and that I was taking Kira home. Renee's face didn't crack. That's what should have warned me sooner than it did. "You can make this difficult if you want," she said, still pleasant, still reasonable, like she was discussing a scheduling conflict instead of a child. "But I'd think about whether that's the version of this you want a judge to hear about." I didn't know yet what judge she meant. I found out 3 weeks later that there were 2. Kira didn't say anything on the drive home. She sat in the back seat with the backpack across her lap instead of on the floor, same as in the office, both hands resting flat on top of it like she was holding something down instead of just holding it. I asked her twice if she was okay, and both times she said yes in the small, careful voice she'd used that first month living with me, the one I hadn't heard in over a year. I told myself it was shock. Any 9-year-old would go quiet after a scene like that. I didn't push. I've thought since that pushing might have gotten me the truth 4 months earlier than I actually got it, and I've had to make peace with the fact that I'll never know for sure, because some doors only open when the person on the other side decides it's time, not when you knock the right way. Renee didn't let it drop after the school. Over the following 2 weeks, she called my mother twice, telling her she'd made mistakes and was trying to do right by her daughter now. Careful, sympathetic language clearly aimed at building an audience of people who'd vouch for her sincerity, if it ever mattered in a courtroom. She texted my sister once, a long message about how hard the last 2 years had been for her, how she hoped Paige could understand a mother's complicated choices. Paige forwarded me the screenshot with a single line of her own. "She's building a case, not a bridge." I didn't respond to any of it directly. I told myself again that maybe I was being unfair, that grief and shame make people reach out clumsily sometimes, and that clumsy wasn't the same as calculated. It took me another 2 weeks and a folded piece of paper to understand that with Renee, in this particular season of her life, they were exactly the same thing. The second crack came from my own attorney, and it came fast, because Renee didn't waste any time either. I called Naomi Whitlock the next morning, a family law attorney with 12 years practice who'd handled the original divorce and custody paperwork and knew our file cold, and got an appointment for that same afternoon, which told me something about how seriously her office was already taking a single frantic voicemail. Her office was small, 3 rooms above a dry cleaner, but every wall was lined with case boxes labeled in a handwriting so neat it looked printed. "A verbal demand at a school changes nothing," Naomi said, flipping through our old file while I sat across from her desk still in my work clothes, sawdust still in the creases of my knuckles. "Custody is custody until a court says otherwise, and right now the court says it's yours. But if she's serious, she'll file a modification petition, and once she does, we're not dealing with a bad afternoon anymore. We're dealing with a case." I asked her what changed circumstances would even mean for someone who'd been silent for 6 months. Naomi didn't sugarcoat it. "It means whatever she can make sound plausible to a judge who's never met either of you," she said. "That's why timelines matter more than feelings in this room. Feelings are hers to perform. Timelines are ours to prove." She was right, the way lawyers usually are about the things you'd rather they weren't. 11 days later, a process server found me on a job site in front of of a client's half-open electrical panel and handed me an envelope with Renee's petition inside, citing changed circumstances as grounds for a custody modification here. I read it standing in a stranger's garage with wire strippers still in my back pocket, and I felt my hands go still in a way that had nothing to do with steadiness and everything to do with my body refusing to shake in front of a client. I drove straight to Naomi's office afterward and let my hands shake there instead. The third crack didn't come from an institution at all. It came from Kira, 3 nights after the petition arrived, sitting cross-legged on her bed with that same backpack pulled into her lap the way she always kept it now. I'd come in to say goodnight and found her staring at the zipper instead of at me, not moving. The lamp on her nightstand throwing a small, warm circle over both of us in an otherwise dark room. I sat down on the edge of the bed and asked what was wrong, and for a long moment she didn't answer at all, just kept looking at the zipper like it might unzip itself and save her the trouble of deciding. "I have to show you something," she finally said, "and I need you to not be mad that I didn't show you sooner." I told her I wasn't going to be mad. I meant it when I said it, and I still meant it 20 minutes later, even though by then my hands weren't steady anymore. She unzipped the front pocket, pulled out a folded, slightly soft-cornered piece of paper that looked like it had been unfolded and refolded 100 times, and held it out to me without looking up. "I've had this since the night she left," she said. "I didn't know if it mattered. I didn't want to lose it, so I kept it in here instead of my room, because you always check my room but you never go through my backpack." I asked her, as gently as I could manage, with my pulse suddenly loud in my own ears, why she'd never told me. She shrugged, the specific small shrug of a kid trying to make something enormous sound reasonable. "It felt like it was mine," she said. "Like if I gave it to you, it would stop being mine and start being everybody else's." I wasn't ready for that yet. I think I am now. It had fallen out of the lining of that half-zipped suitcase the night Renee dropped her off, she told me. She'd found it on the porch after Renee's car pulled away, picked it up without really understanding what it was, and decided, in the specific quiet logic of a 9-year-old who has just watched her mother leave, that if her mother had dropped something important, she wasn't going to just hand it back for free. She'd kept it as a kind of insurance she didn't have a name for yet. I unfolded it under her bedside lamp and read the case caption at the top, "Case Gnome FC 2026-1183. Underneath, in the flat procedural language of a filing neither of us had ever been meant to see, a sentence that took me 3 reads to understand the weight of, noting Ms. Castillo's prior voluntary relinquishment of minor child KM as a factor weighing against a finding of demonstrated parental fitness. KM, Kira Malone. My daughter's own initials, sitting in the middle of a stranger's legal filing, describing the worst night of her life as a data point in someone else's case. I didn't sleep that night. I called Naomi at 8 the next morning before her office even officially opened, and read the case number to her over the phone with my coffee going cold on the counter. She called back 4 hours later, having spent the morning pulling what public docket information she could and making one careful call to a colleague who did work in the county's family court, and the 4th crack came in her voice before it came in her words. "It's real," she said. "It's active. It's not our case, Nolan. It's a separate family court matter, and it's not about Kira at all. It's about a baby." Renee had a newborn now, 4 months old, with a man named Wade Correa she'd been living with since sometime after the divorce, a fact I hadn't known until that phone call, delivered in the same flat tone Naomi used for everything, because that's the only tone that keeps you upright through a conversation like that. A CPS caseworker named Miriam Solis, 8 years with the county's child welfare division, had opened a welfare check on the newborn back in the spring after a report from a neighbor concerned about noise and unattended crying, and the case had escalated into a formal fitness evaluation conducted by a court-appointed custody evaluator named Owen Pratt, a licensed clinical social worker who'd handled fitness evaluations for the county for over a decade. Naomi read me the broad strokes of Solis's original intake notes over the phone. 2 visits in March where Theo was found alone in his crib for what neighbors estimated was upward of 40 minutes at a stretch, a home Solis described in her notes as cluttered but not unsafe, and a recommendation, cautious rather than alarming, that the case remain open for continued monitoring rather than immediate removal. It was that continued monitoring, Naomi explained, that had eventually led to Owen Pratt being assigned to conduct the full evaluation Kira had unknowingly been carrying in her backpack for 6 months. Pratt's report ran to 11 pages, most of it standard developmental and household stability assessment, but with one section devoted entirely to parental history, and it was that section that explicitly cited Renee's abandonment of her older daughter as evidence of a pattern the court needed to weigh before deciding whether she was fit to keep her son. I sat with that for longer than I'm proud of. Somewhere underneath the anger was something worse, a kind of vertigo, the understanding that the same 9-year-old who'd spent 6 months quietly re-zipping a suitcase under her bed, half convinced this arrangement might also fall apart, had also been carrying, unread and unexplained, the exact document that proved why her mother had left her in the first place, and the exact document that would eventually decide whether her baby brother got to keep his. Naomi put it plainer than I could have. Renee didn't come back for Kira, she said. She came back to fix her paperwork. She needs to show active, voluntary custody of her older child to counter Owen Pratt's finding before Judge Farrow rules on the newborn case. That school visit wasn't reconciliation, Nolan. It was evidence collection. I confronted Renee myself once, against Naomi's advice, at a supervised exchange point 2 weeks later later, where we were both dropping off paperwork through our attorney's offices instead of speaking directly, except she caught me in the parking lot before I made it back to my truck. She looked tired in a way she hadn't looked at the school. The careful blazer traded for a plain sweatshirt, like the performance only came out for audiences that mattered. I asked her, flat out, if this was about Theo. I'd learned his name from Naomi's file by then, and saying it out loud in front of Renee felt like handing her a piece of leverage I hadn't meant to give. Renee's face did something I hadn't seen since the divorce, something almost like relief, like she was glad someone had finally said it instead of making her say it first. You don't understand what it's like, she said, voice dropping out of the pleasant register for the first time since the school office. If Pratt's report stands, I don't just lose ground with Theo, I lose him. Wade's family has money for lawyers I don't have. I needed to show the court I could show up for a kid. She stopped herself, hand pressed briefly over her mouth like she could physically take the sentence back. I asked her quietly whether any part of that sentence had ever actually been about Kira. She looked past me toward the building instead of at me. I know how that sounds, she said. I'm not a monster. I just ran out of good options and she was the one I had left. I told her that wasn't an answer to my question. She didn't try again. She got in her car instead, and that was the last time I spoke to her before the hearing. Colin Vance made one more attempt on her behalf 4 days before the hearing, in the form of a settlement letter to Naomi's office proposing that Renee would voluntarily withdraw her petition in exchange for our agreement not to raise the FC 2026-1183 filing at all, not in the hearing, not anywhere else, sealed by mutual consent as though it had never fallen out of a suitcase lining onto my porch. Naomi brought the letter to me still warm from the printer and let me read it twice before she said anything. This is the whole case in one page, she said finally. She's not offering to make this right, she's offering to make it quiet. I didn't have to think long about my answer. Kira had carried that piece of paper for 6 months so that someday, someone would finally read it out loud in a room where it mattered. I wasn't going to be the adult who folded it back up and put it away a second time, just because folding it away was more comfortable for everyone except her. Naomi sent back a one-line reply declining the offer, and 5 days later, we walked into Judge Albrecht's courtroom with Exhibit F still very much on the table. Naomi's office spent the next 5 weeks building the file the way I imagine a good electrician traces a short, methodically from the panel outward, checking every connection instead of guessing where the spark started. A guardian ad litem named Inez Bautista, 15 years in family court advocacy, was appointed to represent Kira's interests independent of either parent's attorney, and she met with Kira 3 times over those 5 weeks, twice at our kitchen table and once alone in her own office. I sat in on the first meeting, at Inez's invitation, mostly to watch rather than to speak. She never once asked Kira anything that sounded like a legal question. She asked what her favorite subject was, whether she still liked the pale green in her room, what she and I usually did on Sunday mornings, and only near the end, almost gently, whether there was anything about the last 6 months she wanted a grown-up outside the family to know. Kira talked about the suitcase habit without my prompting, and about the backpack, and Inez wrote things down without ever making it feel like Kira was being recorded instead of heard. I wasn't in the room for the second meeting, the one alone in Inez's office, and Inez couldn't tell me everything that was said there. That conversation belonged to Kira, not to me, and Inez was careful about that boundary in a way I came to respect even when it frustrated me. What she could tell me, because it was relevant to her final recommendation, was that Kira had described her mother's departure in specific, unprompted detail, down to the exact sentence Renee had used on the porch, and that when Inez asked what Kira would want to happen if a judge asked her opinion directly, Kira had said she didn't want to be asked that question at all. She just wanted the grown-ups to look at the paper and figure it out themselves, the way she'd been quietly hoping they would since the night she found it. That answer became one line in Inez's eventual report, but it was the line that stayed with me longest. A 9-year-old who had already done the hardest part of the adult's job for them, and who was still, even then, hoping someone else would be the one to finish it so she wouldn't have to stand up in a courtroom and say it herself. Inez's final written report, filed 2 weeks before the hearing, noted that Kira had expressed consistent, stable attachment to me and significant anxiety around the possibility of being returned to her mother's household, the kind of sentence that reads clinical on paper and levels you completely when you know the 9-year-old behind it. Naomi subpoenaed Owen Pratt's full evaluation from the separate case, confirmed through Miriam Solis's CPS file that the newborn welfare check had never been formally closed, and cross-referenced the timeline. Renee's school appearance had come 9 days after Pratt's preliminary report was served on her attorney, Colin Vance, and 11 days before her own custody modification petition against me was filed. Naomi laid all of it out on her conference table the night before the hearing, the way Kira used to lay out flashcards, tabbed and numbered, Exhibit A through Exhibit F, and told me the same thing every good family attorney tells a client the night before a stranger in a robe gets to decide the shape of their family. You're not on trial tomorrow, she said. The timeline is. Let it speak for itself. She spent the last 20 minutes of that session walking me through what she expected from Colin Vance, that he'd lean hard on Renee's changed circumstances and try to paint 6 months of silence as a mother finding her footing rather than losing her nerve, and coached me gently but firmly not to take the bait if he tried to get me to argue with Renee's character on the stand instead of sticking to the timeline. Judges don't reward the parent who sounds angriest, she said. They reward the parent who sounds steadiest. You've been steady for 6 months already, Nolan. Tomorrow, just be exactly that person, out loud, in a room. The hearing was set for a Wednesday morning in front of Judge Corinne Albrecht, a woman with a reputation, Naomi told me, for losing patience fast with anyone who tried to perform sincerity instead of demonstrating it. I had 18 hours between Naomi's office and that courtroom to decide something I hadn't let myself think about until then: whether I was actually willing to put the document Kira had been guarding for 6 months into evidence in open court, where it would become a permanent part of a legal record, where someday, 10 years from now, 15, my daughter might have to explain to someone what it had felt like to be 9 years old and carrying her mother's abandonment of her in writing in the front pocket of her backpack because she hadn't known who else was safe to hand it to. I sat in my truck in Naomi's parking lot for 20 minutes that night, engine off, hands on the wheel, running the same math over and over. Protect Kira from the permanent record. Protect Kira's custody. Two goods that wouldn't both fit into the same courtroom the next morning. If I held the document back, Renee's petition might still succeed on its own. Propped up by 6 months of silence I couldn't fully explain to a judge who hadn't lived it. If I entered it, my daughter's private, hidden, careful 9-year-old logic became a courtroom exhibit forever. Something she might have to answer for at 16, at 25, in front of people who never knew her at 9. There was no version of that choice that felt clean. My hands wouldn't stop moving on the wheel even with the engine off, tapping some rhythm I hadn't chosen and couldn't make stop. I called Inez Bautista that night, past normal office hours, and asked her the only question that mattered. She was quiet for a moment before she answered. Kira already made her choice, Inez said. She held on to it for 6 months instead of throwing it away, and she handed it to her mother herself before anyone in a courtroom ever asked her to. The question isn't whether she can handle this being real. It's whether you're going to let the person she trusted with it be the one who finally finishes what she started. I didn't sleep that night. Kira stayed with Paige for the morning. Naomi had been firm that a modification hearing was no place for a 9-year-old, regardless of how central she was to it, and Inez had agreed. And the last thing Kira said to me before I left the house was, "Tell the judge I kept it safe." I told her I would, and I meant it, though I didn't yet know exactly what shape that promise would take once I was standing in front of a stranger in a robe. I don't remember much about the drive to the courthouse the next morning so much as I remember arriving at it, the way you sometimes surface out of a long dive without remembering the swim backup. The courtroom on Wednesday morning was smaller than I expected. Wood paneling, fluorescent light with a faint hum, 12 rows of empty benches behind 2 long tables. Naomi had told me to expect an empty gallery. Family court hearings weren't public spectacle the way criminal trials were, and there was something about that emptiness that made it feel both smaller and heavier, like whatever happened in that room only had to convince one person instead of a crowd. Renee sat beside Colin Vance in a gray suit that looked more careful than anything she'd worn to the school office, her hands folded on the table in front of her, still, composed, the same performance of reasonableness she'd given the front desk aide. Judge Albrecht came in briskly, a stack of files under one arm, reading glasses already on, and got through the preliminary matters in under 2 minutes before asking Colin Vance to lay out the changed circumstances his client was citing. He talked for almost 10 minutes about Renee's stabilized housing, her new relationship, her desire to reunite her family, every sentence landing smoother than the last, and I felt my stomach drop with every word because he was good, and because none of what he was saying was technically a lie, and because a judge who hadn't lived the last 6 months had no obvious reason yet to doubt any of it. My hands wouldn't stop moving under the table, folding and unfolding the same corner of a legal pad Naomi had given me until she put her hand flat over mine just once, a signal to stop. I made myself watch Judge Albrecht's face instead of Vance's mouth, looking for any sign she was buying it. Her face gave away exactly nothing, which somehow felt worse than if she'd looked skeptical. When it was our turn, Naomi didn't raise her voice. She laid Inez Bautista's report on the table first, then Miriam Solis's CPS file, then Owen Pratt's evaluation with the sentence about prior voluntary relinquishment of minor child KM, underlined in the copy she handed up to the bench. Then she picked up the folded, soft-cornered paper Kira had carried in her backpack for 6 months and asked the court's permission to enter it as Exhibit F. Colin Vance was on his feet before she finished the sentence, objecting that the document was already part of a separate, unrelated proceeding and had no bearing on custody of Kira. Judge Albrecht took off her glasses, looked at the exhibit for a long moment, and then looked at Renee directly. "Counsel," she said, "your client's own custody evaluator, in a different case, on the record, cited her history with this specific child 9 days before she showed up unannounced at that child's school demanding physical custody, and 11 days before she filed this petition. I'm going to need someone in this room to explain to me why that timeline isn't exactly what it looks like." Colin Vance didn't have an answer that survived contact with the question. He asked for a 5-minute recess. When they came back, he withdrew the petition rather than let the judge rule on the record with that timeline sitting in front of her. Renee didn't look at me during any of it. She looked at the exhibit itself, once, for maybe 2 seconds. The same soft-cornered paper her own daughter had been guarding against her for 6 months, and something moved across her face that I couldn't name and didn't try to. Not shame exactly, not surprise, something closer to the specific exhaustion of a person watching a plan finally run out of road. She gathered her things quickly once Colin Vance finished withdrawing the petition, didn't ask to speak to me in the hallway, didn't look back toward the door on her way out. I stood there afterward, still catching up to what had just happened, while Naomi quietly started packing the binder back into its accordion folder beside me, Exhibit F sliding back into its tab like it had never been anything more than paperwork. It didn't feel like winning, not right away. Judge Albrecht confirmed my full legal and physical custody of Kira, ordered that any future contact between Renee and Kira go through a supervised family services coordinator until further review, and noted for the file, the way judges do when they want a sentence to follow someone into their next courtroom, that the petition appeared to have been motivated by circumstances external to the child's welfare. That sentence made its way, through channels Naomi explained to me in language I only half followed, into Owen Pratt's supplemental filing in the separate case in front of Judge Dominic Farrow. I don't know everything that happened in that courtroom, because it was never mine to sit in. What I do know is that Miriam Solis's office kept the newborn welfare case open for another 4 months of supervised check-ins, that Wade Correa petitioned for and was granted primary physical custody of Theo during that period, and that Renee's position in her son's case ended up exactly as damaged as it would have been if she'd never come back for Kira at all. A cost, Naomi pointed out quietly on our way out of the courthouse, that she'd brought entirely on herself, the same way a wall doesn't start a fire on its own. It just waits for someone to give it a reason to spark. The supervised contact the order allowed for never actually happened. The family services coordinator assigned to the case reached out twice in the following 2 months to schedule an initial visit. Renee didn't respond to either message. Naomi told me matter-of-factly that this wasn't unusual, that parents whose real objective had never been the child in question tended to lose interest fast once the child stopped being useful to whatever they'd actually been chasing. I didn't tell Kira that part outright. I told her when she asked whether her mother might visit sometime that the door was open if her mother ever chose to walk through it, and that either way, nothing about her own life was waiting on that choice anymore. She nodded like she'd already worked that out herself, months before I said it out loud. Paige was waiting in the parking lot when we came out, leaning against her car with her arms crossed like she'd been standing there the whole 2 hours instead of just the last 20 minutes. She didn't ask how it went. She could read it on my face before I said a word, and instead crouched down to Kira's height and asked her seriously, like it was the only question that mattered that day, whether she wanted pancakes or waffles to celebrate. Kira said pancakes. It felt like the first ordinary sentence either of us had gotten to say out loud in weeks. I think about Theo sometimes, a baby I've never met and never will, half-brother to my daughter, caught in the middle of a strategy that was never his to survive. I hope Wade is steadier than the file made him sound. I hope somebody braids that kid's hair someday and means it. There wasn't a version of this where everyone came out whole. There was only a version where the person who deserved protection the least stopped being able to use the person who deserved it the most. Kira asked me, the night after the hearing, sitting at our kitchen table with her backpack finally sitting on the floor where backpacks are supposed to go instead of in her lap, whether she'd done the right thing keeping that paper for so long instead of just giving it to me the first week. I told her the truth because she's earned nothing less from me since the night she showed up on my porch with one suitcase and a stuffed rabbit and a mother who called her a problem instead of a daughter. I told her that no 9-year-old should ever have had to be the one holding the evidence, that it was never supposed to be her job, and that I was sorry it became her job anyway, for 6 long months, because the adults around her hadn't given her a version of the truth simple enough to just hand over. She thought about that for a while, turning her water glass in a slow circle on the table. Then she said the only thing that stayed with me since. She said I was your problem now. She looked up at me, steady in a way that had nothing childish left in it. I don't think I ever was one. I think I was just the only piece of proof either of you had left. Principal Holloway called me a week later, not about anything urgent, just to check in, and mentioned almost sheepishly that the front office had updated its protocol since October. Any custody-related pickup dispute now went straight to her office instead of the front desk, and any parent not on the approved pickup list got redirected before they ever reached a child in the building. I keep thinking about how calm she looked, Holloway admitted. I've been doing this 11 years, and I've learned to watch for the parents who are shouting. I never thought I'd need to watch for the ones who weren't. I told her I understood exactly what she meant, better than I wished I did. Kira turned 10 in the spring, 7 months after the hearing, and we had the kind of birthday party that felt almost aggressively ordinary on purpose. A backyard, a bounce house I overpaid for, Paige's terrible potato salad, Ms. Ebe stopping by for 20 minutes because Kira had asked if she could invite her. At some point in the afternoon, watching her run across the grass with 2 girls from her class, laughing at something I couldn't hear, I thought about the last thing she'd said to me at our kitchen table the night after the hearing. I think I was just the only piece of proof either of you had left. And I thought about how much distance a kid can put between who she was forced to be and who she's actually allowed to be, if you just give her enough ordinary Saturdays in a row. She caught me watching from the porch at one point and waved, backpack nowhere in sight, both hands free, and came running over just to tell me the bounce house was, in her exact words, actually pretty good for something you picked. I still have that folded piece of paper. Naomi keeps the original in the file. I kept a copy, soft-cornered now in a different way, tucked into a drawer instead of a backpack, because some things are still worth holding on to, even after they've finished doing their job. Kira doesn't pack that suitcase under her bed anymore. I checked a few weeks after the hearing, quietly, the way you check a panel one more time, even even after you're sure the short's been fixed. It was empty, pushed all the way to the back of her closet, exactly where you'd put something you'd finally stopped needing to keep ready.